The bitter wind of early November cut through the narrow streets of the sprawling capital, carrying with it the stench of damp cobblestones and the distant cries of street vendors. Within the fortified walls of the royal palace, the air was thick, with incense and whispered prayers. In the dimly lit chamber a child was born, an heir to an empire whose name had echoed across the continent for centuries, yet whose future was shrouded in misfortune before his first breath had even drawn life. The boy, named Leopold, was welcomed with a ceremony that was more ritual than celebration. Candles flickered against gilded walls, casting long shadows that seemed to twitch and sway as if alive. His mother, Queen Adriana, a woman whose beauty was tempered by a quiet melancholy, clutched his tiny form with trembling hands. She had been warned by physicians and astrologers alike that the blood that nourished this child was both royal and tainted. Leopold was the product of generations of careful yet disastrous inbreeding, each union designed to consolidate power within the family, but each step leaving a scar deeper than the last. From the very beginning, it was clear that this child bore the weight of his lineage not only in title, but in flesh and mind. His skin was pallid, almost translucent beneath the thick swathes of silk that swaddled him. His limbs seemed fragile, his hands gnarled and small, the fingers curling as if in anticipation of unseen suffering. The royal physicians frowned at his disproportionate features, a jaw that protruded unnaturally, a tongue that seemed too large for the mouth that struggled to contain it. Whispers of the curse of our blood drifted like smoke through the corridors, muttered by attendants who dared not speak aloud the dread that gripped their hearts. Leopold's first years were a harrowing testament to survival. He did not crawl on time. His first steps were a wobbly triumph against bones that seemed unwilling to obey. Speech came in broken fragments, words that garbled the music of the court into discordant noises. Despite this, the palace could not afford to coddle the heir, for the machinery of governance waited for him to grow, to one day wear the crown that would secure the fragile unity of the kingdom. Even in the cradle, Leopold seemed to harbor an awareness of his own cursed existence. He would stare at empty corners of his chamber with wide, unblinking eyes, tracking shadows as though conversing with entities invisible to all but him. Servants who ventured too close reported the sensation of being watched, a chill crawling along the spine as the child's gaze followed them. At night, the palace echoed with sounds that could not be explained, cries that belonged neither to a child nor an adult, laughter that twisted unnaturally, and whispers that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The queen, torn between fear and duty, maintained her composure in public, but privately trembled at the knowledge that her son's life was a fragile flame in a storm of fate. She consulted physicians, apothecaries, and mystics, all of whom offered remedies that ranged from the plausible to the preposterous. Herbal poultices, purges, and exorcisms were performed with equal fervor, each intervention leaving Leopold weaker, yet somehow more tenacious in his struggle to cling to life. By the time Leopold reached his 4th year, it was evident that the child's body and mind were as much a battlefield as the courts of Europe. Each seizure, each fit of incomprehensible anger or sudden despair, left scars on the souls of those who attended him. Courtiers whispered of demonic possession, of shadows that had claimed the heir's innocence before it could ever bloom. Yet, no matter the suffering, Leopold survived, a fragile testament to both the cruelty and resilience encoded in his royal blood. Outside the palace walls, the kingdom stirred. Foreign powers watched, sensing the fragility of succession, the potential for upheaval should the boy not endure. Advisors debated in hushed tones about marriages and alliances that might preserve the bloodline, but the boy's very existence was a threat and a promise intertwined. The corridors of the palace became a stage for power and fear, with Leopold at its center, a child who bore both the grandeur and the grotesque consequences of dynastic ambition. And so, the boy grew, wrapped in silks and shadows, watched by those who loved him and feared him in equal measure. Each breath he drew was a reminder that even the mightiest throne could not defy nature's decree. The birth of Leopold, heir to the cursed crown, was not merely the arrival of a child. It was the opening of a chapter of darkness that would stretch across years, leaving scars that would outlast kings and kingdoms alike. The palace, a labyrinth of stone and gilded hallways, had become both prison and sanctuary for young Leopold. Each morning, the first shafts of light that pierced the high windows revealed the boy's fragile body, a miniature figure swaddled in layers of silk, yet unable to rise without aid. Servants tiptoed past his chambers, casting nervous glances at the shadows that seemed to cling to the corners, watching as though sentient. The child's cries, unpredictable and piercing, echoed through the vast corridors, mixing with the distant clatter of armor and the low murmur of nobles debating the kingdom's future. Leopold's existence was punctuated by episodes of inexplicable violence. One afternoon, while attempting to grasp a wooden rattle, his small hands convulsed violently, knocking over a silver cup that shattered against the marble floor. The courtiers, who had assembled for an audience, recoiled in horror as the child's scream warped into a strangled guttural sound that seemed beyond human. His governess, a stern woman with deep-set eyes and a face carved from stone, held him tightly, murmuring prayers under her breath as shadows danced along the vaulted ceiling like sinister specters. Despite these episodes, the boy exhibited moments of eerie clarity. In the dim light of the palace library, he would crawl to the edge of the throne room balcony, staring at the city below with a focus that unnerved even the most seasoned courtiers. His gaze seemed to penetrate the world itself, as if he could see the currents of fate twisting beneath cobblestones and riverbeds alike. Whispered rumors began to circulate, that Leopold communed with spirits invisible to all others, that the palace walls themselves responded to his will. These tales spread quickly, feeding a mixture of fear and fascination among the nobles. The queen, Adriana, struggled with her own despair. Each day she witnessed her son's body grow frailer, the pronounced Habsburg jaw locking in grotesque angles, his tongue lolling unnaturally when he attempted to speak. Physicians reported intermittent seizures, digestive failures, and sleeplessness that left him in a trance-like state for hours. They experimented with poultices, elixirs, and whispered charms, yet nothing arrested his decline. Adriana spent nights awake, rocking the boy in her arms, listening to the faintest whispers from the shadows, wondering if these were the murmurs of spirits or the echoes of a mind already fraying at the edges. Outside the palace, the kingdom began to sense the fragility of its future. Foreign envoys arrived under the pretense of ceremonial duty, but their eyes were sharp with calculation. Each interaction with the child was carefully observed, as alliances might be forged or broken depending on the slightest sign of health or deformity. Leopold's presence became a mirror reflecting the instability of the empire itself, a realm whose power rested upon the precarious shoulders of a child too frail to wield it, yet whose bloodline demanded obedience. The shadows of the palace deepened during the evening hours, when candles flickered against painted walls and gilded tapestries. In these moments, Leopold's fits often became most pronounced. He would writhe in his crib, screaming in voices that seemed not his own, high-pitched, metallic, guttural, and sometimes speaking in words that none understood, as though summoning forces unseen. Servants whispered of a demonic presence, convinced that the boy was inhabited by spirits beyond mortal comprehension. Each exorcism performed by the palace chaplain brought temporary calm, a fragile peace that dissolved almost immediately, leaving the air thick with the stench of incense and fear. Yet even in darkness, Leopold's mind occasionally shimmered with brilliance. During quiet hours, he would study the intricate patterns on tapestries, following the woven lines with unnerving precision. His small hands, though weak, traced the curves and symbols as if understanding the hidden meanings behind each thread. Some courtiers speculated that the child's suffering had honed his perception, granting him a vision that surpassed ordinary comprehension. Others feared it. A mind so sharp yet trapped in a body so frail, a prisoner to its own anatomy and the cruel dictates of inheritance. Night after night, the palace bore witness to the boy's struggle between corporeal weakness and inner intensity. Whispers of shadows and spirits intertwined with the calculated plots of nobles, creating a world where fear and ambition coexisted with suffering. Every candle flicker, every shadow that stretched along the walls, every echo of a distant footstep, became part of the theater in which Leopold, the fragile heir, was both actor and victim. The boy's life was not just a story of illness, it was a tale of dread, power, and inevitability. The palace itself seemed to pulse with the knowledge that its future depended upon a child born of both privilege and catastrophe. And in the flickering candlelight, the shadows whispered secrets of the past and omens of the future, a tapestry of human folly and suffering from which none could escape. Leopold, the doomed heir, lay in his crib, eyes wide and alert, as though, aware that every breath he drew was both a defiance and a surrender to the dark inheritance that had been thrust upon him. The palace at dawn was a hollow shell of light, where shadows clung to walls like cobwebs, and every echo of a footstep resonated with the weight of dread. Leopold, now 6 years old, had grown frailer but more fearsome in presence. His once tentative cries had evolved into guttural wails, vibrating the air with the intensity of both pain and will, a voice that spoke to a world he alone seemed to perceive. The court had learned to walk carefully around him. Servants whispered that the boy's eyes reflected more than human comprehension. They mirrored the endless corridors of suffering etched into his body and mind. Seizures came with alarming frequency, leaving him limp and twitching, his jaw locked, in grotesque angles, saliva dripping in rivulets onto the silk beneath him. Even the most seasoned physicians recoiled at the sight, their hands trembling as they attempted to examine him. They spoke of supernatural forces, of an illness that defied both science and prayer. In these episodes, Leopold would sometimes speak in voices that were not his own. High, childlike tones mingled with deep animalistic growls, uttering words in tongues unknown to any living linguist. Courtiers described the sound as a cacophony of torment, a dirge that seemed to summon shadows into the room. Candles flickered violently, walls appeared to breathe, and the boy's tiny frame twisted in ways that no human anatomy should allow. It was as if the palace itself conspired with his suffering, each stone and tapestry a witness to the relentless agony imposed by both inheritance and fate. Queen Adriana, her face pale and lined with exhaustion, watched helplessly. Nights were spent in near-total darkness, rocking Leopold in her arms while he convulsed, murmuring to invisible beings, and sometimes staring at her as if he could see her very soul. Letters she penned to foreign courts trembled with despair. She feared for the boy's life and for her own sanity. The physician's remedies, poultices, bloodletting, herbal concoctions, did little more than prolong his suffering. The very air around him seemed saturated with disease and decay, a miasma that clung to all who approached. Even moments of clarity brought no comfort. When Leopold's small hands rested still, his eyes would fix upon some unseen horizon, wide and unblinking, tracing patterns in the flickering candlelight. He seemed to read the shadows, deciphering their hidden language, understanding truths far beyond his years. Nobles who observed this behavior were simultaneously awed and terrified, interpreting it as either a sign of genius or a prelude to a terrible fate. The political dimension of his condition was ever present. Envoys from neighboring kingdoms, under the guise of ceremonial observation, scrutinized the boy for weakness. Each convulsion, each scream, each moment of vacant staring was catalogued and interpreted as either proof of divine disfavor or a harbinger of opportunity. Intrigue ran like poison through the corridors. Even as Leopold writhed in suffering, his existence became the fulcrum upon which the fate of empires balanced. As the months wore on, the palace itself seemed to conspire with the boy's torment. Shadows pooled in corners. Oil lamps cast grotesque shapes across the walls, and the smell of incense mingled with the faintly metallic tang of blood and decay. Each chamber held echoes of prior convulsions. The memory of pain was ingrained in the very stones. Servants avoided the child's chambers, some claiming to have heard whispers in dead languages, others swearing that the boy's gaze had followed them through corridors, tracking not only movement, but intent. Yet in the midst of suffering, Leopold's perception deepened. He noticed patterns in the chaos, the subtle inclinations of courtiers, the trembling hesitation of physicians, the faint fear in his mother's eyes. Though trapped in a body that betrayed him, his mind, sharpened by adversity, recognized the machinations surrounding him. And so, even as he writhed and screamed, he also observed, cataloging the actions of those who surrounded him, a silent witness to both human cruelty and misguided devotion. It was during one particularly violent seizure that the boy's anguish became almost unbearable to watch. Bound lightly to his bed, he convulsed, limbs flailing, a mixture of incomprehensible laughter and tortured wails escaping his lips. The room was drenched in flickering light and shadow, incense smoke curling into every corner, while courtiers and physicians alike stood frozen in dread. This was not merely illness, it was a theater of suffering, a grotesque manifestation of generations of flawed bloodlines converging in a single fragile human vessel. Leopold's torment was a silent testament to the cost of dynastic ambition, a reminder that even kings-in-waiting were not immune to the relentless cruelty of nature and inheritance. The child, small and fragile, had become a symbol of both the grandeur and grotesque corruption of the palace, a living embodiment of shadows that would haunt the empire for decades to come. By the winter of his 7th year, Leopold had become an emblem of despair, a living relic of a lineage poisoned by ambition and inbreeding. The palace corridors echoed with the faint, irregular taps of his small, feeble steps as he attempted, often in vain, to traverse the halls. Each stride was a battle, his knees trembling beneath him, his spine curved in grotesque angles, jaw locked, tongue thick and heavy in his mouth. Shadows seemed to recoil from his presence, yet simultaneously reach toward him, as though the architecture itself mourned his existence. The court, once a hub of calculated diplomacy, had transformed into a theater of dread. Nobles whispered behind hands and fans, their eyes darting toward the boy's chamber where cries, laughter, and guttural growls intermingled in an unsettling symphony. Physicians, long accustomed to disease, approached with hesitant reverence. The treatments, poultices, leeches, herbal concoctions, were increasingly desperate and brutal, each applied with trembling hands, often leaving the child in greater agony. The palace walls themselves seemed to absorb the suffering, the ornate tapestries and frescoes stained not by time, but by the lingering aura of torment. Leopold's mind paradoxically became sharper as his body weakened. During moments of fleeting lucidity, he would fixate on the subtle manipulations of courtiers, discerning allegiances, fear, and duplicity with the intuition of a predator despite his fragile form. He would whisper to himself, speaking of plots, of shadows that moved not with the light, of unseen forces shaping events. Servants avoided these moments, believing that listening might draw the darkness upon themselves. Night times were the worst. Bound lightly to his bed to prevent injury during seizures, Leopold writhed violently, voices erupting from him in cacophonous tones. High-pitched laughter twisted into guttural roars, his eyes rolling into the back of his head as though unseen spirits toyed with his body. The palace chaplain and assistants, chanting prayers and sprinkling holy water, became part of the theater. Rituals that brought fleeting respite, but could not halt the inexorable decline of the child's physical form. The air smelled faintly, of incense, sweat, and metallic decay, a scent that clung to all who entered, embedding the horror into memory. The queen, Adriana, teetered on the brink of madness. She watched the child with a mix of devotion and terror, rocking him through convulsions, whispering entreaties to God, begging the shadows to relent. Her letters, written in trembling script to allied courts, were fragments of desperation and political maneuvering. She sought aid, counsel, and, perhaps unconsciously, absolution. The palace had become a dual theater, a stage of suffering and a chessboard of dynastic intrigue. Leopold's rare moments of clarity became hauntingly profound. He would fixate on candle flames, shadows lengthening and bending across the chamber, perceiving patterns invisible to the human eye. Courtiers who observed these moments described a chilling awareness, an intelligence trapped within a frail, contorted body. The child seemed to know the unspoken motives, the lies and fears of those around him, a mind sharpened to a knife edge by confinement, pain, and observation. Even the architecture conspired with the boy's torment. The vaulted ceilings of the palace, the long corridors, the tapestries, and the cold stone floors, all became mirrors of suffering. Shadows pooled and stretched, flames flickered in ominous patterns, and the walls seemed to hum with the memory of agony. The boy's cries, screams, and guttural utterances became an oral manifestation of the palace's dark pulse. In one particularly harrowing episode, Leopold's body became a whirlwind of pain and unnatural strength. Bound to the bed, his limbs flailed violently, teeth clenching, eyes wide, veins protruding, as though he were wrestling with invisible demons. Courtiers and priests alike stood frozen, simultaneously horrified and entranced. The ritual of exorcism, performed under the harsh glow of torchlight, seemed to transform the chamber into a battlefield between mortal flesh and unseen forces, with the child's small frame at the epicenter of chaos. Leopold's suffering was more than physical. It was a reflection of the palace itself, of a dynasty teetering on collapse. Each convulsion, each guttural utterance, each twisted moment of clarity revealed the fragility of a lineage built on arrogance, ambition, and the cruel arithmetic of bloodlines. The child's body, a battleground of inherited deformities, and his mind, a sharp instrument forged in adversity, encapsulated the tragic culmination of generations of human folly. The court could only watch, powerless, as the boy navigated a world that had become a theater of shadow and suffering. The boundaries between life and death, clarity and delirium, human and inhuman, blurred within the boy's chamber. Leopold's existence, fragile and tormented, stood as both symbol and warning, a living testament to the price of dynastic ambition and the relentless weight of inherited destiny. Winter had deepened, cloaking the palace in long, frozen nights that seemed to echo Leopold's suffering. The boy, now nearing 8, had grown weaker, his small frame bending under the relentless cruelty of his inherited deformities. Each movement required monumental effort. Each breath was an exercise in agony. His jaw protruded grotesquely, tongue thick and swollen, preventing coherent speech and proper eating. His body, once animated by fleeting bouts of mischief and curiosity, was now a vessel of pain and convulsions. The palace, once a symbol of grandeur, now mirrored the child's deterioration. Shadows clung to every corner, candle flames flickered with a spectral trembling, and the air was heavy with the mingled scents of incense, sweat, and decay. The tapestries, once vibrant, appeared draped in darkness, the gilded walls reflecting, not wealth, but a history of suffering. Courtiers avoided the boy's chambers, their whispered fears mingling with anticipation, knowing that the smallest twitch or convulsion might decide the fate of dynasties. Leopold's mind remained disturbingly sharp, though trapped in a failing body. During fleeting moments of clarity, he would fixate on the subtle machinations of those around him, the envoys who observed with predatory eyes, the physicians who trembled with both reverence and fear, the servants whose whispers betrayed panic. He catalogued their behavior with terrifying precision, a child whose intelligence had been sharpened to a blade by confinement, pain, and observation. The treatments had escalated in desperation. Physicians, driven by both fear and duty, applied brutal remedies, leeches to drain life, poultices that burned as they drew from his skin, herbal concoctions that induced nausea and further weakened him. In moments between these interventions, Leopold would collapse, skin pallid and stretched tightly over protruding bones, limbs flailing with uncontained strength and agony. The palace seemed to shudder with each convulsion, the architecture itself participating in the grim theater of his torment. Queen Adriana's despair deepened. She spent countless hours at his bedside, rocking him through seizures, whispering, prayers that went unanswered, tracing the arc of his suffering with trembling hands. Letters to foreign courts conveyed the political urgency of his condition. Yet beneath the surface, they were cries for help, fragments of a woman's broken spirit witnessing the collapse of her child and dynasty alike. The corridors echoed, with the mixture of her sobs and the child's screams, a symphony of helplessness and horror. The court's intrigue intensified. Each convulsion, each guttural sound, each moment of vacant clarity became a weapon in the silent wars of succession. Envoys and nobles watched, interpreted, and recorded. The child's suffering was a stage upon which dynasties measured opportunity. Shadowed rooms bore witness to whispered plots, bargaining with fate itself, as if Leopold's body were both oracle and casualty in a game too cruel for human comprehension. One night, during a particularly violent episode, Leopold's strength exceeded expectation. Bound lightly to prevent injury, he twisted, flailed, and screamed in tones that oscillated between childlike terror and guttural fury. The flames of candles danced wildly, casting grotesque shadows that seemed alive, undulating across tapestries and walls. The priests, chanting prayers and sprinkling holy water, became part of the theater, their rituals momentary shields against forces unseen yet palpably felt. The boy's convulsions, the shadows, and the chanting blended into a single vision of torment, so vivid that even hardened courtiers could not look away. Leopold's consciousness flickered between moments of agony and sharp perception. He observed, catalogued, and remembered. He recognized deceit in faces, fear in footsteps, and ambition in gestures. Though trapped within a fragile, contorted body, his mind acted as both witness and judge, absorbing the palace's every movement and secret. The boy's suffering, immense and relentless, became the invisible hand shaping the court, a silent arbiter of destiny. By the final days of winter, the child had become almost unrecognizable. His emaciated frame, grotesque deformities, and convulsive vigor turned him into a living monument of biographical horror and dynastic decay. The palace, shadowed and oppressive, existed not as a place of grandeur, but as a crucible of suffering. Leopold's life, bound by inherited flaw and human ambition, was a theater of agony, a stark reminder of the cost of power, ambition, and the dark arithmetic of bloodlines. The palace had become a mausoleum of echoes. Winter's harsh winds whipped against the stone walls, carrying with them an air of foreboding that seemed almost sentient. Leopold, now approaching his 9th year, was a shadow of the child he had once been, though his mind remained unnervingly lucid. Every bone in his small, contorted body seemed to protest against the act of living, his limbs trembling with the effort to maintain even the faintest movement. The grotesque protrusion of his jaw and swelling of his tongue had worsened, rendering speech nearly impossible, while his digestive system had failed almost entirely, leaving him frail and perpetually weakened. Physicians, once hesitant, now resorted to the most extreme measures known to medicine at the time. Bleeding, purging, blistering, and experimental herbal concoctions became the daily ritual. Each intervention left him screaming in tones that were both childlike and monstrous, a horrifying symphony that echoed through the corridors and seeped into the hearts of all who heard. The palace itself seemed to pulse in rhythm with his suffering, shadows dancing and twisting unnaturally across tapestries, gilded panels, and cold stone floors. The queen, Adriana, had long ceased attempts to rationalize or control the events. Her nights were spent at her son's bedside, alternating between desperate prayers and frantic correspondence to foreign courts, trying to secure political advantage while her own spirit unraveled. In moments of stillness, she would watch him, writhe and shake, the light from torches reflecting off his twisted features, and shudder at the cruel arithmetic that had brought them to this point. Her love was entwined with terror, each heartbeat a painful witness to inherited tragedy. Leopold's consciousness had evolved into a grim observer. Even in the height of physical agony, he could perceive subtle shifts in the court's dynamics. The whispered plots, the cold calculations of envoys, the veiled threats of nobles. He recognized fear, ambition, and deceit with an intelligence that belied his fragile form. Yet these moments of insight were always interspersed with seizures, hallucinations, and excruciating physical torment, leaving him suspended between clarity and chaos. On nights when the moonlight fell pale through the high windows, Leopold would speak, or at least attempt to speak, to invisible entities. His words, distorted by his deformities, oscillated between whimsy and menace, laughter and scream. Shadows seemed to respond, curling around corners and pooling beneath tapestries, as if the palace itself were alive with the echoes of his pain. Servants would often find him at dawn, pale and drenched in sweat, murmuring secrets to the empty air, eyes wide with visions only he could see. The court's intrigue escalated as the boy's condition worsened. Envoys observing the mortal collapse interpreted each twitch, each guttural cry, as a sign or omen, weighing political advantage against human suffering. The exorcist's rituals grew more elaborate, drawing in multiple clergy, incense, and chants, turning Leopold's chamber into a stage for public displays of supernatural combat. Yet, no spiritual nor medical intervention could halt the inexorable decline of the boy's fragile frame. One evening, A particularly violent seizure left him sprawled across the marble floor, limbs contorted unnaturally, chest heaving, saliva and tears streaking his pale, twisted face. The court physicians, the priests and attendants hovered, a mixture of awe, terror, and helplessness etched onto every face. Shadows from torches flickered across the walls, turning his convulsions into a grotesque ballet of suffering, an image that would linger in the memory of anyone present for decades. As the nights wore on, Leopold's vitality ebbed further. His body, emaciated and malformed, resembled a fragile skeleton wrapped in the remnants of life. His mind still sharp enough to perceive every whispered fear, every manipulation, every looming threat. The palace, once a seat of power and splendor, had transformed into a crucible of despair, where ambition, superstition, and genetic tragedy intertwined to create a spectacle of unspeakable horror. Leopold's existence became a morbid mirror of his dynasty's fragility. Each heartbeat, each convulsion, each agonized cry echoed the collapse of centuries of ambition, the dark consequences of inbreeding, and the cruelty inherent in the pursuit of power. His life, confined within the palace's dark walls, became both symbol and warning, a testament to the human cost of legacy, ambition, and inherited fate. Spring had not brought renewal to the palace, it had only deepened the sense of inevitable decay. Leopold, now approaching 10, was confined almost entirely to his chamber, his body reduced to brittle bones and skin stretched over jagged joints. Every breath was a labor, every movement required monumental effort. His once lively eyes now flickered with a haunted lucidity, scanning the darkened corners of his chamber as if perceiving specters that haunted only him. The physician's efforts had grown increasingly desperate, bordering on cruelty. Poultices scorched his skin, leeches drained him of precious blood, and experimental concoctions filled his mouth with bitter, burning compounds that caused relentless vomiting. Seizures tore through him unpredictably, leaving him convulsed and exhausted, sweat matting his hair and running down his hollowed cheeks. The chambers echoed with each scream, a cadence of human suffering that seemed to infect the very walls. Queen Adriana remained by his side, but fatigue and despair had hollowed her expression. Letters to European courts now carried not only political urgency, but cries of desperation, revealing a mother whose love was entwined with helplessness. In whispered moments, she watched him struggle against the weight of his own body, and felt the gravity of generations of inbreeding pressing down on her son, a crushing inheritance of suffering. Leopold's mind, sharp and agonizingly aware, catalogued the court's every movement. Courtiers and envoys, sensing the inevitable, pressed for declarations of succession. The child's anguish became a weapon in their hands, a cruel theater where life and politics collided. Shadows in the palace seemed to stretch unnaturally, responding to his convulsions, as if the building itself absorbed and reflected the torment within. The exorcist's presence grew relentless. Father Maricaro and his assistants conducted near-constant rituals, chanting prayers and sprinkling holy water, attempting to purge what they claimed were demonic influences. Leopold's cries, oscillating between childlike fear and guttural rage, filled the chamber, blending with the thick incense smoke to create an almost tangible aura of dread. Even the most hardened courtiers were forced to acknowledge the boy's suffering as both human and otherworldly. As his body deteriorated further, the grotesque features that had always marked him, protruding jaw, thick tongue, deformed hands, became even more pronounced. His limbs bent unnaturally, each motion produced a sickly bone-on-bone sound. Despite this, flashes of intelligence and awareness shone through, as he whispered secrets and accusations to the empty air, a mind trapped in a body incapable of fully expressing itself. Leopold's agony became both spectacle and omen. Courtiers interpreted his convulsions as prophetic signs. Envoys measured the length and intensity of his screams against the shifting balance of European power. Each convulsion, each hollowed stare, each whispered word to invisible entities was catalogued, recorded and spun into political advantage. His chamber, thick with incense and the stench of illness, had become the epicenter of dynastic decay. In his final weeks, Leopold's strength ebbed further. Nights were spent in near constant pain, hours of screaming, alternating with brief, haunted lucidity. Queen Adriana could only watch, holding his hands, whispering prayers, her own spirit fraying under the weight of helplessness. The palace, with its vaulted ceilings and once grand tapestries, seemed to press in upon them. A mausoleum of suffering where the line between human agony and political intrigue blurred into a singular oppressive shadow. Leopold's impending death cast its dark influence across the court. Noble families maneuvered, foreign powers prepared, and the boy's suffering was both a warning and a catalyst. The final days were marked by a surreal intensity. Convulsions, whispered conversations with unseen figures, fleeting moments of recognition, and the overwhelming presence of decay and inevitability. It was a crucible of human suffering and political consequence, a dark prelude to the collapse of a dynasty. The dawn of that fateful day broke with a gray, oppressive silence. No birds sang in the gardens, no wind disturbed the towers. Leopold, now 10 years old, lay in his grand chamber, emaciated and contorted, a fragile remnant of life stretched across silk sheets. His chest rose and fell with immense effort, each breath a battle against the relentless decay that had claimed his body. Queen Adriana, exhausted and trembling, had kept vigil beside him, her hands cold from gripping his, frail ones for hours on end. She whispered prayers, her voice cracking as she watched the boy she had born into a world of political machinations, hereditary tragedy, and cruel destiny. Outside the chamber, the court had gathered in tense anticipation, knowing that the final moments of the heir would dictate the fate of empires. The boy's convulsions had grown weaker, but more grotesque in their extremity. Each movement was a silent scream, each flutter of his eyelids a glimpse of a mind trapped within a failing vessel. The exorcists, priests, and physicians hovered nearby, their chants, incense, and remedies now a desperate accompaniment to what was clearly the inevitable. Candles flickered as shadows danced across the vaulted ceiling, painting grotesque shapes that seemed to echo the boy's torment. Leopold's gaze, piercing despite the emaciation, scanned the room intermittently. In these final conscious moments, he perceived the court's whispered schemes, the courtiers' ambitions, and the inevitable political collapse that would follow his demise. His lips trembled, forming words that were barely audible, a combination of childlike plea and haunting prophecy. No force on earth or heaven could halt the course of his suffering, or the tragedy encoded into his very genes. As the hours passed, his physical strength ebbed entirely. Muscles once capable of trembling in anger or fear now refused their command. His skeletal form was a stark silhouette against the thick silk and candlelight. Queen Adriana held him close, feeling the weight of his fragile body, whispering comfort, as much for herself as for him. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath, the air thick with incense, sorrow, and the shadow of impending death. Suddenly, a convulsion seized him one last time, twisting his body into an unnatural arc. His cries were weak, almost musical, a final lament that resonated through the chamber. The priest sprinkled holy water, the physicians checked for signs of life, and the queen whispered, her voice breaking, "You may go, my child. You are free now." In the quiet that followed, Leopold's breathing slowed, each exhale longer and fainter than the last. His eyes, wide and haunting, flickered once more to the faces around him. Then, at precisely mid-afternoon, he drew his final breath. The chamber fell into an eerie stillness, a silence so profound that it seemed to absorb the faint flicker of candlelight. Life had left him, but the shadow of his suffering lingered, palpable and suffocating. The courtiers and foreign envoys, who had hovered in tense anticipation, were forced to confront the human cost of dynastic ambition. Some wept, others turned their attention to political calculations, yet all were marked by the grotesque spectacle they had witnessed. Queen Adriana, broken by grief, retired to a private chamber, unable to face the rituals and displays of succession that would follow. Leopold's death marked not only the collapse of a young life, but also the fracturing of a dynasty. Within hours, the court erupted into calculated maneuvers, the weight of inheritance and succession driving decisions that would plunge nations into conflict. Yet beneath all political calculation, lay the inescapable human tragedy of a child destroyed by centuries of hereditary ambition, superstition, and cruel circumstance. As his body was prepared for burial, the court could only marvel at the grotesque toll exacted by generations of inbreeding. The deformed jaw, the atrophied muscles, the skeletal frame, and the small damaged organs testified to a life lived under the shadow of genetic disaster. The chambers, once filled with whispers of ambition and intrigue, now carried the silent echo of suffering, a reminder that power and privilege could not shield a human being from the consequences of history's cruelty. In the aftermath, the palace became a mausoleum of memory. Leopold's image, twisted yet hauntingly vivid, would be recounted in hushed tones and recorded meticulously, a symbol of both the fragility of human life and the dark legacy of dynastic obsession. The court moved forward, empires adjusted, alliances shifted, yet the human cost remained an indelible mark, a cautionary tale etched into the annals of history.